Molly here. If you're a regular listener to our channel, then you've probably heard us talk about influential science fiction from the 1960s. Today, we're going to talk about one such show. There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. Today, we're discussing The Outer Limits. The original run of The Outer Limits aired from 1963 to 1965. There were 2 seasons, 49 episodes in total. There was a revival in 1995, but we're not talking about that today. We're only talking about the 1960s original run. The show used an anthology format, meaning that each episode was a standalone story. That means you can watch any episode, and everything you need to know for that story will be contained in that single episode. With that being said, we have selected 2 episodes to discuss today. The first is Season 2, Episode 1, titled Soldier. The second is Season 2, Episode 5, Demon with a Glass Hand. Both episodes were written by Harlan Ellison. Demon with a Glass Hand won Ellison a Writers Guild Award. Season 2, Episode 1, Soldier, first aired September 19th, 1964. It was written by Harlan Ellison and was an adaptation of his 1957 short story, Soldier from Tomorrow. In the television episode, there are 2 soldiers in what turns out to be Earth's future. They have both been bred to kill. Being a soldier is their only purpose. They exist only to kill the enemy. The soldiers are fighting each other, and due to a freak accident with the weapon fire, they are thrown into a time vortex. One soldier, played by Michael and Sarah, lands in 1964, but the other is trapped in a half-materialized state. The soldier that made it through has trouble understanding the strange world around him and keeps fighting like he was trained and conditioned to do. It isn't long before he's picked up by the authorities. The soldier keeps repeating what seems to be a nonsensical phrase, so a language expert is called in. The language expert, Tom Kagan, played by Lloyd Nolan, is able to ascertain that the soldier is speaking English, and he's been repeating his name, rank, and serial letters. The soldier's name is Quarlo. Kagan takes pity on Quarlo and eventually takes Quarlo into his own home to live with him, his wife, his son, and his daughter. Quarlo is immediately drawn to the Kagan family's cat. It's revealed that in the future, cats are used for reconnaissance and communicate with soldiers by telepathy. Quarlo has a difficult time fitting in because nothing around him is like the war zone he came from. Things seem to be going well in helping Quarlo to adjust, but then Quarlo breaks into a gun shop and steals a rifle. At the same time, we see that the other soldier has finally completely materialized. Kagan goes to the gun shop and brings Quarlo home. The Kagan's cat starts to vocalize, drawing Quarlo's attention. We then see the other soldier coming through the wall of the Kagan's house. Quarlo immediately throws himself on the armed intruder and wrestles him to the floor. The weapon discharges and both Quarlo and the other soldier are killed. The audience is left to wonder if Quarlo was merely acting on instinct or if he had grown to care about the Kagan family and gave his life to protect them. A voiceover at the end of the episode poses this question and goes on to state that the answer lies in a future where men are machines born to kill. This episode would become the basis for a lawsuit against James Cameron and the Terminator film in 1984. The matter was settled out of court, and the Terminator credits now include acknowledgement to the works of Harlan Ellison. The next episode we're going to talk about is Demon with a Glass Hand, Season 2, Episode 5. This episode was also written by Harlan Ellison and originally aired October 17th, 1964. The episode opens with a man, played by Robert Culp, telling us he was born a full-grown man 10 days previous, and he has no memory of anything before that. Someone has wiped his memory clean. He does know that someone is trying to kill him, and his left hand is a computer that can tell him what to do. But 3 of the fingers are missing, which means the information stored on those fingers is missing too. What the hand can tell him is that he must destroy the time mirror that allows his pursuers to follow him through time. It's imperative he stays alive because destiny is in his whole hand. It's also established that he needs to complete the hand for the computer to be fully functional. The episode is fairly simple in its plot. The man's name is Trent. The things pursuing him are alien invaders from the future, called Kybon. They want Trent's hand because it contains all knowledge. They already have 3 of his fingers. In the future, Trent is the last man alive. He is the last hope for Earth. In his pursuit of the time mirror in his fingers, he meets a woman called Consuelo, who falls in love with him. Consuelo is played by Arlene Martel, which many of our viewers will know as T'Pring from Star Trek the original series. Trent destroys the time mirror, defeats the Kybon, and gets his fingers back. He then learns that he is a robot, and amongst his circuits is a wire upon which the human race has been electronically transcribed. He is the guardian of the human race. After learning the devastating news that he is not human, he reaches for Consuelo's hand, and she pulls away. She walks out the door and leaves. Alone, Trent must now wait over 1,000 years to free the human race. There was quite a bit of crossover between The Outer Limits and Star Trek. Michael Ansara would go on to play Commander Kang. Arlene Martel played T'Pring. Leonard Nimoy, William Shatner, James Doohan, and Grace Lee Whitney also appeared in episodes of The Outer Limits. Props and effects from The Outer Limits also found their way over to Star Trek. Both the Horta and the Transporter effect appeared on The Outer Limits and were repurposed for use on Star Trek. The relevance this has today is mostly due to JMS, J. Michael Straczynski, which many people will know as the creator of Babylon 5. He is currently the executor for Harlan Ellison's literary estate. In fact, there is an anthology that is going to be published on October 1st of this year. It is book 3. It is called The Last Dangerous Visions Anthology. And it was originally Harlan Ellison's work from many decades ago, which he never finished. And fortunately for us, JMS has put it together and it is actually going to be published. Obviously, since it has not yet been published, we don't know exactly what's going to be in there. But from what I understand, there are some modern writers that are going to appear in the anthology, one of whom is James S.A. Corey, better known as the writers behind The Expanse. So that's something that we can look forward to that is actually applicable and reaching back in time to Harlan Ellison, even though he's been gone for a number of years now. So, Harlan Ellison. A lot of people have a lot of nasty things to say to him, largely due to the fact that he didn't hesitate to defend his intellectual property, and that is obviously seen in the lawsuit against James Cameron and the Terminator. According to Harlan Ellison, it was his story Soldier that the lawsuit was based upon, though many people also believe that James Cameron drew from Demon with a Glass Hand as far as his inspiration for the Terminator series. Frankly, after watching several episodes of The Outer Limits, it seems to me that it wasn't just Harlan Ellison's stories that were the inspiration for the Terminator, but it seems that James Cameron must have spent an awful lot of time studying The Outer Limits when he created the story, The Terminator, because there's just so much there that it looks like it's actually derivative work from that show. Not just Harlan Ellison's work, but from other episodes as well. Although I personally, as a writer myself, I give Ellison credit for standing up for what was very blatant, as far as I'm concerned, use of or inspiration from previous work. Ellison himself said that he wouldn't have filed the lawsuit if they had just given him credit or acknowledged what was going on. In fact, rumor has it that the studio had been going to great lengths to make sure that Ellison was unable to see any kind of previews for the film because apparently they knew that they had ripped him off. And whether or not that's actually true, obviously, that's many years removed now, so we'll probably never know. But it really is pretty damning. And of course, James Cameron gives an alternate view of this, that he's angry that instead of going to court, that the studio and the insurance company chose to settle with Ellison. But again, these are words from someone who lost. And I'm not so sure that his day in court would have gotten him anything better than what happened with the settlement. In fact, the insurance company didn't want to go to court because they were afraid it would end up being so much worse than what was settled for. The settlement was undisclosed, and there was a gag order on the parties involved. They weren't supposed to talk about what happened. However, before the end of his life, Ellison did start talking about what happened because at that point he just didn't care anymore. And I can't blame him for that. However, obviously Ellison is gone. Cameron is still here, so at this point, who gets to set the narrative? It's going to be James Cameron. And again, years removed, who knows what the truth is. But frankly, after watching these episodes of The Outer Limits, the two that I just mentioned, and then a few others, it just really appears to me that James Cameron should have, at the very least, given some sort of credit. Although, again, obviously, it's all about money. All of this is about money. But if you're going to so blatantly recycle ideas from someplace else, especially since James Cameron had actually stated in an interview that he was greatly inspired by The Outer Limits, boy, was that mishandled to a huge degree.
Harlan Ellison is a name that has gotten around science fiction circles for a long time. I think the Star Trek community on our channel would know Harlan Ellison from probably the most famous Star Trek episode, The City on the Edge of Forever. Although rumor has it that was heavily modified from Ellison's original work, and I believe Ellison wasn't happy about that, but I'm sure people in our comments could give a better history of that than we could. It's also interesting because our last video, we made a clip video contrasting Philippa Georgiou's Empress character from the mirror universe of Star Trek Discovery and a Deathwalker episode from Babylon 5. And one of the clips that we were using for Babylon 5 still had the opening credits. And on those opening credits, it had creative consultant Harlan Ellison. When you look at Babylon 5 as a whole, Harlan Ellison was a creative consultant at the beginning part of the series. I don't know how far that relationship lasted, but I believe it went into at least the first 2 seasons. And going back to The Outer Limits itself, in addition to those 2 episodes you mentioned, The Man Who Was Never Born, which was not written by Ellison, but the story behind this was a person from a post-apocalyptic Earth traveled back in time to remove the person who created this virus that caused mutations in the Earth to get destroyed. And while that person was back in the past trying to find this person to kill, he found out that he was too early, and that it turned out his new mission was most likely to kill the parents of the kid that eventually turned out to be the scientist that created the virus. And they centered on the mother. For those of us who are familiar with the Terminator franchise, the Sarah Connor character and the mission of killing the mother before the rebel leader was born, thus stopping the humans from winning that battle. This was kind of an inverse of that, where you were trying to kill off the mother of somebody who turned out to do horrible things in the future. But when you look at this and those other 2 stories, it gets kind of squirrely as far as I'm starting to believe Ellison's take on this.
Well, especially when you look at Terminator 2, when Sarah went to execute the man who was responsible for Skynet. That is really a very close corollary to what we saw in that episode. So yeah, it really looks to me like the Terminator franchise was based on a few Outer Limits episodes. And again, like, if James Cameron had given credit, that would have been one thing. But it looks like he's just another repurposer when he does things like this. And whether or not that's the case, it's not for me to decide, but it sure looks like it to me.
And Cameron has done other pieces of work. besides the Terminator. Because I remember liking a lot of James Cameron's work. I remember The Abyss was a movie that I enjoyed quite a bit, and I would recommend to people who haven't seen it before that that's one to check out. It's just, when you look at something like Avatar, and you see how that's derivative of a few different things.
Yeah, James Cameron has been accused of plagiarism quite a bit, or at least being at the very most benign derivative of other work. So yeah, it really makes you question how good of a writer this person is when so much of his work has been accused of being plagiaristic, or you can see a direct corollary between what he did and what somebody else did before him.
To give credit, though, James Cameron had more going on than just stories. He had a certain feel to his movies. And I do think James Cameron has talent. He has quite a bit of talent. So I'm just going to say it's unfortunate that this Outer Limits stuff came up in his career, because we've made mention in our Secret Hideout reviews that we don't have a problem if somebody is basing a story on a previous work, but then you have to put in the credits, based on a short story by, and then you give credit. And then you can move on from there, and Molly and I are perfectly fine with that. It's when you repurpose something and you don't give credit, if you don't change it up enough where it's its own work by itself, that's where we start to have problems with things. And Strange New Worlds in particular has repurposed a few different ideas that we've had some problems with.
Discovery did it too. Yeah. So I would say, Bad Robot, I take that back. Secret Hideout.
It's the same thing.
I know.
Despite what people want to say, the whole company's called Secret Hideout. And why is it called Secret Hideout? Because that little bad robot's hiding inside of it. They purposely made that name to shove it in your face what they're doing. And there are people that defend that. That's not J.J. Abrams. That's Kurtzman's. No, it's that whole Abrams setup. They're all working together behind the scenes. And Secret Hideout is nothing more than the little bad robot hiding inside of it.
Yeah, so Strange New Worlds had a lot of those problems. Discovery actually ripped off Ursula Le Guin. Both shows ripped off Ursula Le Guin. And we made a video about that. I guess I'll put the link at the end. But yeah, I loved the Terminator franchise. Well, I loved Terminator 1. I loved Terminator 2. The movies that came after that, not so much. But I loved the first two. And it wasn't just about the story. The cinematography was also extremely well done. And again, it does take some talent to take a short story and write it into a full-length film. So I do give credit for that. However, like the old man just said, the fact that acknowledgement wasn't given until after being sued, that's what I've got the problem with.
Now that said, because this video isn't supposed to be about James Cameron ripped off the Outer Limits.
No.
But we picked those two episodes because it was written by an author that people should know about. And then it tied into the Terminator. But that series, The Outer Limits from 1963, there were many, many good episodes in that series. And it's interesting because the way I look at The Outer Limits, these series, is the Twilight Zone started in 1959, I think. And so there was a rush to kind of copy that success. And The Outer Limits was one attempt at that. I believe One Step Beyond was another attempt at that as well. Whereas the Twilight Zone had some science fiction stories and other very humanistic type stories, The Outer Limits was nothing but science fiction. So the way I look at The Outer Limits is it's the Twilight Zone, but only science fiction episodes. And there were a few clunkers in their 2-season run. I'm talking The Outer Limits here. But very few clunkers as far as I'm concerned. Lots of okay episodes and a few really good episodes. Strangely enough, the two that Molly talked about are two of the better ones of The Outer Limits. And so it's difficult to give a review for an anthology series where every episode is different. There's no story elements that go from one episode to the other. So we picked 2 episodes that had an author that people would know, plus there was a little bit of extra history there. But there were quite a few episodes there that I could go on and praise as being good episodes. I mentioned The Man Who Was Never Born. That was a good episode. I believe that was season 1. And The Bolero Shield, which had Sally Kellerman in it, and most will remember her from the TOS episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. And also, if you watch 70s films, she was the original Hot Lips Houlihan from the MASH movie. There were many Star Trek ties in here. I believe Shatner was in 1 episode. I think Nimoy was in 2. Doohan was in 1. And it's interesting just to watch the episodes and just pick out different characters, because I'm trying to remember. I think there were like some bit actors in the background that could have been on the TOS run, but I'd have to go back and look to make sure. So I'm suggesting, if the listener here is not familiar with the Outer Limits series from the 60s, that one, take a look at the series. And if nothing else, take a look at Soldier, The Demon with the Glass Hand, and I would also suggest The Man Who Was Never Born. Because if nothing else, you can watch those as kind of a trivia thing and then see how you think they tie into the Terminator franchise and see if you think there's any sort of case there. But there are other episodes in the run that are actually pretty darn good. And maybe in the future, we'll do a run and kind of cover the highlights of some of the better episodes of The Outer Limits. But we just wanted to kind of give an introduction to the series here, and we wanted to talk about the 2 episodes themselves. I mean, one of the interesting pieces of trivia is from Demon with the Glass Hand. That was shot in the Bradbury Building. And that should be familiar to people because in the original Blade Runner movie from 1982, at the end there, when Roy and Deckard were chasing each other, for lack of a better word, that was also shot in the Bradbury Building. It's a very unique architectured building. In Demon with the Glass Hand, the kind of negative for me is the baddies in that. They went a bit low tech when they were making the baddies.
They look a little bit like Uncle Fester.
Yeah, they had makeup with like dark circles under their eyes. Just the costuming is a little bit iffy. But you have to use your imagination. We're talking 1963, well, 64, I think, if we're talking this episode. And so you have to give them a little bit of slack here. But through most of these episodes, and this is something I like about watching old black and white stuff, because the Twilight Zone did a lot of this too, is the use of shadows and blocking. They made for interesting looking scenes that, honestly, once things went to color, you just didn't really see much anymore. I liked watching a lot of just the way things looked in black and white, especially in the Demon with the Glass Hand. There was a lot in that Bradbury Building where it was a atmosphere that they were setting up with the look of what you were seeing when they were going through the building. Going back to the Soldier episode, there was some leaps of story logic there for me, like this super dangerous soldier that they were trying to get this guy to trust, I guess, the government people that were talking to them. And so they figured, well, let's let him live with this family, this linguistic guy with his wife and 2 kids. And I'm thinking, a guy who was built to murder since he was initially hatched, because I guess that's another story element we didn't mention, is in this future with that soldier, humans weren't born per se. They were kind of incubated, cloned, incubated, and spit out.
Yeah, he came from a hatchery.
So I'm just like, this guy has been nothing but a killing machine from probably very early year. Then he's being asked to live with this family. So there was some potential that they could have done some humor with this, but they didn't. It could have been funny, like if the daughter, who was a teenage daughter, if they would have had like a boyfriend show up and Qualo giving him kind of the side eye, that could have been something that was funny. Or is it Quarlo?
Quarlo.
But they didn't do any of that. It was taken seriously for most of the run that they did. And I would recommend that if you haven't seen the 60s Outer Limits, that you try at least those 2 episodes. And like I said, The Man Who Was Never Born, that's also another good one. And that has Martin Landau in it, and he was in a few episodes of this series. You would know Martin Landau most likely from Space 1999. We've talked before about there are certain things I think people should be familiar with if they're going to consider themselves a rounded science fiction consumer, I guess we'll say. And Space 1999 is one of those things that you probably should get familiar with, and maybe one day we'll do a review on that too. So from my end, I love The Outer Limits. I also love The Twilight Zone. I think these are vastly underrated as of recently. They used to be considered in high regard, but I don't know, once the turn of the century happened and we got into the 2010s, people don't talk about those series much anymore.
Well, I think I know part of the reason why. Well, obviously part of the reason why is that the writers these days, I don't think, are familiar with that stuff. But I think a larger issue is that, for instance, The Outer Limits, season 1 was very monster of the week, but there was still usually a moral lesson or a philosophy that was being explored. And season 2 was primarily the philosophical stories. I think that these days they don't want science fiction exploring moral dilemmas. I think these days they want it to be more of the, look at that cool space battle, very much eye candy driven. And also, I'm just going to say this, especially when it comes to Star Trek Discovery, I think that they are setting out a narrative and they don't want you thinking about it. You're just supposed to consume it. And that is all.
Well, one of the episodes of The Outer Limits called OBIT, O-B-I-T, it's an acronym. That has to do with when surveillance goes out of control. And although that was not directed at anything in particular, watching it now in 2024 and the messaging that they were putting in there about the dangers of that sort of mass surveillance, that's pretty relevant to today. And I could see why they wouldn't want that sort of messaging getting out there, because they were portraying this as a bad thing in that Outer Limits episode.
And then there was another episode, The Architects of Fear. It was a group of scientists who got together and created a false flag incident where they took one of the scientists and turned him into an alien so that they could have an alien drop to Earth and unite humanity against this threat through fear to avoid World War III, because, well, humanity was fighting amongst themselves. So they thought this false flag would bring people together. And again, like a lot of these episodes, you look at what's in them, and it's very interesting because the lessons are still very, very relevant.
There was always some morality lesson that was being pursued, at least in part, sometimes in great. Architects of Fear. The fact that a group of scientists would get together and think that creating a scarecrow like this and creating a false flag situation would force people to work together and not war amongst each other, and not think of the ethical dilemmas of what they're doing. There's good stuff in these episodes. Like, there's a lot of good stuff because it was written in a different era, but the same problems still happen no matter what era you're living in. They just might change a little bit depending on the decade that you're living in. But the same moral dilemmas of, well, is doing this really the best idea to do? Do I have the right to make this decision for the rest of humanity? There's lessons there that back in the 60s apply even now in 2024.
And it's a shame that we aren't seeing those questions being explored in entertainment now. We are working on our own project.
We're going to have a launch video in October, at least outlining what we're planning for phase 1 of hopefully a many-step process here. And we talked about this a few videos ago, where we wanted to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to creating new scripted content. We're still going to do our reviews of things, but we actually want to start making original content. And I don't mean original reviews, if there's such a thing. We're already doing that. Like scripted content with characters, dialogue, and so forth. A new franchise, as it were, if we want to call it that. Although that's probably being more grandiose than we're originally going to start here.
Yeah, we're going to start out small, a single character doing some vlogging about her time working on a space station. So just a single character speaking to the camera. Very small, but we see that as a stepping stone to bigger things. So we will be putting out a video about that in October. So we have that to look forward to because, like the old man said, it's time to put our money where our mouth is.
And we should have more details in October. We should have some screenshots of what we're doing, I guess, from the initial pilot stage of what we've been doing. We've been evaluating lots of software, lots of workflows, because we need to figure out a process that's going to give us some high quality end product without it being a 2-year project. Because that's one thing we've noticed is people tend to concentrate online on making independent films, and those usually take 2, 3, 4 years to make. Whereas we want to make independent television. And so that means we have to come up with a fairly quick workflow to crank out episodes while maintaining a pretty high quality. And we've been experimenting with different ways of doing that, and we think we have a path forward. So in October, when we launch what we're doing, we are probably going to ask for viewers' opinions on what we've proposed, as well as any ideas they like or don't like in what they're seeing out there now. Because I think we want to get some input from people, not just us, on just ideas about stuff.
Or even just talk about what you miss from old school television, old school science fiction, and what you'd like to see in the future.
We're going to talk about this one project in October. And we're not ready to talk about the other project that will come after this one. But the next one, hopefully, is going to be a much larger endeavor, assuming that we can get this October launch to happen. But I don't want to say any more than that because I don't want to make any promises we can't keep.
Yeah, let's just start small and see where things go from there. One last thing, and if you're interested in watching the 60s Outer Limits, you can find it on the Roku channel, Pluto TV, various other outlets for purchase, such as Amazon. So I highly recommend watching those episodes if you get the opportunity. The first episode of the series is kind of meh, but stick with it and you'll get to the good stuff.
Well, the great thing about this series, it's an anthology, so you can skip around and you're not going to miss anything. The Galaxy Being, I think, was the pilot, and it's okay, but I would not say it's one of the stronger episodes of the series. In fact, let's just recap the episodes we have talked about today. So we talked about Soldier, which is a Season 2 episode.
Season 2, Episode 1.
Demon with the Glass Hand.
Season 2, Episode 5.
And then I believe Season 1 is The Man Who Was Never Born.
Yes.
And then Obit, O-B-I-T, I believe that's Season 1 as well. And then The Architects of Fear, I also think is Season 1. I think it's like Episode 3, maybe. You'd have to look that up. But those episodes I just listed, just try those out. If you're not sure if you want to jump on board with the rest of the series, just try those out. You can skip around. They're just individual episodes.
Yeah, The Sixth Finger, if you're familiar with Lawnmower Man or Flowers for Algernon, that episode was very much in line with those other two stories. The Bolero Shield, that was another good episode. Again, there's a moral that's involved in the story. Yeah, skip around. Start with those episodes we mentioned and, expand from there.
And you can, because this is not serialized.
No, it's an anthology.
It's not even episodic, where at least you have the same characters. Like, these are all, no episode needs to come before another episode. So you can watch these in any order you want, and you're going to have the same experience as if you watch them in order.
And like I said earlier in this video, book 3 of the Dangerous Visions series, the anthology, The Last Dangerous Visions, is scheduled to come out on October 1st. So, look that up as well, or the previous 2 books that Harlan Ellison published while he was still alive. There's a lot of good science fiction out there, but unfortunately right now we have to try a little harder to find it because it's not readily available through the mainstream. I guess that wraps it up for this video. As I said, you know what? There's stuff out there. We just gotta go find it. So until next time.
Take care.